Senators Pavley and Senator Bell to the hearing. I have a few questions and then ask my colleagues if they have any questions. And for my colleagues, Professor Deacon, who some of us know fairly well, Mr. Bell and I know from our experience on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, was unable to join us today because she's ill. So, Mr. Rogers, let's start with something we've heard a lot in comparisons with other DOTs that Mr. Kaufman brought up about the administrative costs. Could you respond to that? Mr. Kaufman said 42 cents for every dollar goes to administration, 22 cents inspection of projects, but in Arizona it's only 19 cents on administration. Does that stand out to you? Is there some validity to that when you look at administrative costs compared to other DOTs, state DOTs?
Well, in this and other questions, I want to make sure that Eric feels free to respond. Do we look at the relative administrative costs?
Yeah, so we made a number of attempts, as folks at CalSTA can attest, because we worked with them on this sorts of questions and tried.
Could you pull your microphone a little closer?
Yes.
Sorry.
On the state-to-state comparisons, we spent a lot of time on it. We couldn't satisfy ourselves that we weren't comparing apples to oranges. There's so many things that are different in different states that almost in an early iteration of the report we had some of that, and as we delivered it to CalSTA, they sort of poked holes in it, and it's just really, really tough. So I guess all I can say is that we can't say that it's not true, but weren't able to find enough evidence that we were satisfied with that showed that.
So is there a way for us to...
They seem to spend a fantastic...
Microphone, Mr. Rogers, please.
They do seem to spend a fantastic amount of time compiling reports with no clear purpose. And it is very much a sort of a rule-bound culture.
So this would go somewhat to the comments in your report about a culture of fear, that people are afraid to change the boundaries and the rules?
Yeah, as in any highly bureaucratized setting where you have rule-bound process, people feel they can't depart from the rule. And if process is what's driving it rather than outcomes, you have no substantive basis for departing from the rule. So what more modern management does is it gives people more autonomy if they can justify departures from previous practice and allows them to experiment a bit. What you guys have to recognize is that experimentation can sometimes fail. And I would expect you're going to have errors as they go through this big change over the next couple of years. That's another thing I didn't highlight enough, perhaps, of what the legislature needs to do.
This is one of the ironies, of course, to this organization compared to the pressures from the private sector in California. The culture in the private sector is exactly the opposite.
Yes.
And
yes.
There's some benefit and some drawbacks to that people don't feel afraid of failing 4 or 5 times before they hit it right. And then we have in this public agency this fear of even attempting to do anything. So since you are the experts and you look at other DOTs, and feel free to jump in here, Secretary Kelly, the administrative cost seems to me the first place to start is what's the best industry standard for a state DOT when you define administrative costs, and is there a template you can give us that's considered best practices in that regard so that we could move to that? The inability to even measure whether that's a problem or not strikes me as a huge first problem that we have to address. Brian, you're shaking your head. Did you want to address that, or Mr.
No,
Rogers?
I think the issue is a fair one for further examination. 42% is a figure that it's higher than a figure I've ever heard in my 18-year career of dealing with transportation in California. I've never heard it expressed at that level. I have heard it, though, at about a third of a project cost, and so I'm familiar with that figure, and I think it depends in part on what you calculate as part of that project development cost, environmental review, what elements make that up, and so I think it's a worthy area for exploration.
So as we look at, when we look at the mile marker project,
Yes.
that seems like that's something that we should partner with you to try to define for our sake and for the general public and for the contractors what goes in that. I mean, because of the requirements under the California Environmental Quality Act, perhaps there's added costs. There are plenty of people who say that there are, and we have to make a policy decision every year, it seems like, every session on whether that cost is worth the benefit.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I just maybe broadening out a little bit from the specific issue of the administrative cost, just on the mile marker generally. That publication is the first of its kind for the department. It's a start. But I do want to just flag that I think as we go forward on establishing a new sense of mission, vision, and goals, and we align our performance measures toward that mission, vision, and goals, our ability to communicate on how we're doing against that matrix is what that report needs to become. As you know, Senator, we've got into that business much because of the work that you did legislatively and the joint trip that you took with our staff to look at what Washington did in this area. So I just want to flag that I see that document as evolving as our mission, vision, and goals evolve at the department, and I think it can reflect any variety of matrix.
Let me follow on, and I don't want to take too much time because I know my colleagues want to jump in here, but that jumps to the pure, honest, the challenge in front of us. So when we, Undersecretary Ennis and our staff went up to look, along with some of our partners in the private sector, to look at what Washington State did. So for my colleagues, Washington was in a similar situation as I view we're in now, where they were about to fall off a fiscal cliff 15 years or so ago. They tried to do a statewide sales tax. It failed miserably. The polling showed that the level of confidence in the Washington Department of Transportation was in its mid-20s%. We can all relate to this as people who stand for election. It's similar to that for Caltrans right now. So what they did in Washington, as was simply explained to us, was they had a new director came in and said, we're going to do three things. We're going to have projects on time, they're going to be on budget, and if they're not, we're going to be open and transparent with the public. It's not rocket science. It's sort of retail government interaction as a former retailer. Having said that, and so then they did that, and within, I think, a 5-year frame of time, they went from 28% approval ratings for the DOT to 80%. And lo and behold, they went out and got the voters to buy into it. So that leads us to, from a retail politician, the very simple challenge of we have a $300 billion shortfall in our needs to maintain our current infrastructure system. We have no evidence. We have a perfect storm of financial challenges when it comes to cash flow because of the success of Senator Pavley's work in the field of making our fleet more efficient, and indeed the country and the world's, and I always tease her she doesn't get enough credit for AB 1493 because everybody focuses on her great work on AB 32. But we now see, and because the Obama administration reestablishing CAFE standards, a fleet that's becoming transformed by its efficiency, but our gas tax is going in the opposite direction. So when we look at VMT or hot lanes or all these other things, all of these things require the public, by our Constitution, to support being taxed to invest in our Department of Transportation. So we didn't talk much about transparency, although Mr. Kaufman brought up a number of things in terms of documents. So, Mr. Rogers, maybe from your experience, how does, other than Washington or Eric, you see this challenge we are under, and much of your report goes to this, but give us 3 or 4 things we need to do right away. And one of it may be an honest discussion amongst us here in the legislatures. How do we get out of the way but still provide that proper oversight? So 2 or 3 simple things, because it's, when it ultimately comes down to it, you've got a huge cultural challenge within a very large agency, but a fairly simple matrix on what we have to accomplish in the next 3 to 5 years.
Right. Well, I do think that the first step on the mission goals, et cetera, helps, because then you know what you want to go after. Then I could see any number of, and you can see this in different state DOTs. I don't want to elevate Washington particularly with its gray book, but I think Maryland, I think Massachusetts even, I certainly think Colorado, I think Illinois. You know, there are a variety of other state DOTs that have a more effective, so we're user interface with the public to report their progress on certain declared goals. Caltrans doesn't do that particularly well, but you can't do that at all well unless you have those goals that are specified. So you need the goals specified very clearly, and then you need some common sense, understandable metrics on the achievement of those goals, and you need to talk about progress. You know, I'm very impressed with what Governor O'Malley has done in Maryland with state stat and all that stuff. They basically are measuring everything in ways that the government, that the public understands, and it does in fact build confidence in exactly the way you said. It did in Washington. I don't know if we underestimate it, but we can't overestimate it. You're not going to get the public on your side unless it knows what you're doing and believes what you're doing. But you guys have a responsibility not to just do the gotcha stuff as well, right? You have to see this as a process that's very, very important to the public well-being, and try to support the department in fending off the people, or the little gnats that are going to always come at it.
Can I go to one thing about our relationship?
Eric may have other views. Is that about right?
Yeah, so I would add that this is an issue that we've addressed in Massachusetts specifically, but around the country incidentally. The first thing people tend to go to in transparency is on time, on budget on projects. Mm-hmm. I would just say that that's important, but you can't leave it at that. You tend to then you might get a project that shouldn't be built, but it's on time and on budget. You might get one that's over-designed, that's on time and on budget. So that it may seem a little frou-frou that we keep going back to this mission and vision and goals, but it's absolutely essential, because we think that one of the key questions is to state that more clearly, in a more modern way, in a way that encompasses sustainability and economic and other outcome goals that you have, and not just hammer on the project delivery stuff, because Caltrans was organized to build the interstate got built, they're still organized that way. So the gray notebook is great. One of the things that it does, in addition to on time, on budget type stuff, is what they call performance journalism there. And if you were there, you heard Daniela talk about it. So they take an issue, they do a narrative, they explain, our goal is better accessibility in an urban area, more connectivity, more walkability, some of these other things that don't get captured in on time, on budget. Here's how we're doing on that. We don't have perfect measures all the time. Some things there that you don't measure, they're intangible. We've put in some new process that isn't paying off yet, but this is what we're doing to achieve our goal. So transparency, we put a lot of stock in measurement, performance measurement, obviously, because it's a giant agency and you have to have that backbone. But I just want to caveat it with that there is a lot more going on.
And when we spend a good deal of time with Danielle, who is the author of this Gray Book, which was a wonderful story. I asked the question, why did you call it the Gray Book? And they said, well, we didn't have a printing department. We took it down to Xerox, and that's the color they gave us. But performance journalism, I think, is one of the real challenges in this, because I always felt, and this is some hesitancy on the first issue of mile marker, and Brian and I have talked about this, is it's always difficult for public agencies to market themselves to the public, because part of the rich tradition of this country is public's distrust for public agencies, which actually you make a pretty good argument to serve this country well. Let me ask you about a comment you made, Mr. Rogers, about not excluding them, Caltrans, from 375 discussions and invite them for discussions. So all three of us have had long histories in legislative and local government. As I mentioned, Mr. Bell and I were in the regional MPO, and Mr. Bell has a degree in planning. So when I hear that, I actually, I'm completely comfortable. Oh, I thought you did. Oh, you do. Oh, I get you confused all the time. I know. It's the gray hair. It makes you very distinguished. So in 375, although that was one bill authored by Senator Steinberg, there was 20 years of discussion in this state, from Sandag to MTC to the MPO in both San Joaquin County or San Joaquin Valley. So I look at that, and that's one of the questions we have about the size of this state. We try to govern as much regionally as we can, because we don't do well when we govern as a whole state. But there were a lot of discussions in that, and at least at MTC, the regional director of Caltrans was in most of those discussions. So I don't know how better other than to say that's probably the size of the state and the agency to get those, and you mentioned land use discussions in VMT. So this goes to the heart of, I know a lot of us have put a lot of effort into this from the environmental and energy saving standpoint. This has been a pretty robust discussion from my vantage point in this state. But how do you interact with an agency that was supposed to be about highways? And a lot of these agencies didn't want to get in the land use business, because if you got in the land use business, you started to deal with hundreds of local government agencies that were used to doing their land use and the sovereignty of that in an era where people didn't live and work in the same jurisdiction. They were living regionally. So how that interacts with the Department of Transportation, I think, is a challenge for us because of the size of the state, but maybe you could.
Well, I don't in any way want to suggest that working out, getting out of this problem that you have currently is going to be an easy process. I just think it's possible to do. I just think you shouldn't have a transportation department that's only in the business of building highways, period. And you said pretty clearly in state policy, how much of your GHG emissions come from transportation? It's upwards of 40%, right? We went around Caltrans and said, well, yeah, I got involved in land use. And what we heard from people repeatedly is, we don't do land use. Transportation has nothing to do with land use. That is a preposterous statement. And you don't want a culture in your transportation department that upholds that. And then we go around to the 375 people and they say, well, Caltrans doesn't ever come to these meetings. The district manager went to one of them, but he didn't know what he was talking about, et cetera. That is dysfunctional for the state, okay? You've got to have a transportation entity, a state transportation entity that's working well with the regions, is fully participating and aware of what their regional plans are. That's all about land use, very, very substantially about land use. And you've got to get planners and other people in Caltrans that know that language. And they're just not there now. That's all we're pointing out.
No, I think it's a good subsequent conversation, because Jim probably remembers this. I can remember asking that in the regional transportation plan probably close to 20 years ago at MTC, that we just put in the introduction the same language that Sandag had, that said that we should consider the interconnection between transportation and land use. And that was remember what a huge fight that was? So that's a discussion I think all of us would like to have more of.
I think that discussion is over now. I don't know anybody sensible, certainly anybody sensible in California who says, gee, transportation is not connected to land use, is not connected to employment possibilities, is not connected to housing, is not connected to greenhouse gas emissions, except maybe a few folks in Caltrans.
You're right, but your comment was that we should be talking to them more, and my point is, to your last point, is a lot of us have been for 20 years, and there's been a resistance to have that discussion. There's been a huge resistance to have those discussions. So granted, maybe the question is over, but when it goes to cultural change, which strikes me as the bigger problem, and a lot of the comments you have, I mean, there are a lot of great quotes. Brian had a quote that said, collective hunger to modernize the mission. And Mr. Rogers, you said, in interviews, a large unmet demand for change amongst those interviewed. Mr. Kaufman had similar conversations about the real appetite for change from the contractors and from the employees. And that takes us to a larger discussion about, although our goals should be fairly simple and measured and can be measured, but changing a culture in an organization like this takes years and years, and we don't have time for that kind of change. Brian, you're the person who's charged with changing that.
Senator, with your permission, I'll actually just go back for a minute to the issue of 375 and the relationship with Caltrans. There is a narrative in this report that I subscribe to that I've included in other documents that the agencies put out. Our CTIP document that we put online last week, for example. I think what I've captured about this description of 375 and its relationship to the department is, and what I take from the notion that the department needs to be included in this, as we've marched down the path towards sustainability in reaction to AB 32 and SB 375 legislation, that statute does not ask the department to do much. Mm-hmm. And 15 years ago, we passed SB 45, which said, you know, in the STIP process, regions are going to control 75% of the funds.
Former chair of this committee.
That's right, and they're going to program those funds. And so it does sort of lead to this rising question of, and there's no question that in the implementation of 375, regions have answered the call. I was giving a speech this morning, and I noted that you know, we have seen these regional transportation plans be produced around the state in response to 375, and they all have very similar characteristics. There's an enhanced focused on preserving the system or asset management. There's an enhanced focus on mobility choice, more investment in public transit, more investment in bicycling or pedestrian and bicycle facilities as a mode of transportation. Clearly an emphasis on more efficient land use with the push toward reduced vehicle miles traveled. And those are all very important, but those are regional mobility issues and regional growth issues. And I think the question that is asked here is, what of the state? What about the state's answer to that? Who speaks for the state on that, and what does the state do? And how does our responsibility in interregional travel relate to those regional decisions and choices? And that's what I feel like is now presented, and the department has been slow in speaking to. And I feel like the challenge that we have now and the opportunity we have now is to speak to those issues and say, you know, that statewide transportation system has to be more than about counting how many cars we get through the highway system. It's got to include other elements. But I take that narrative and say I think it's fairly true that over the course of the last 15 years, significant transportation legislation, ironically, has been passed and moved forward and has left out the department in terms of being a partner in that. And so I think this report highlights that, and I take that as a great opportunity to step into that void.
Let me ask a couple questions about some of Mr. Kaufman's comments, particularly the issue of more civil engineers positions and fewer inspectors. And at least alluded to in there, I take as there may be some reference to political influence. So are there more engineers than you need and less inspectors? Do the inspectors have fewer expertise? Mr. Kelly, in your view from...
Yeah, to be candid with you, Mr. Chairman, I can't comment on the level of expertise of the inspectors. I will say this, that there are, Malcolm Doherty and I have had this conversation about whether you need an engineering designation for various duties within the department. And we think there are some duties that can be more in the technician level, others that can be on the more engineer level. I think Mr. Kaufman's he described an issue with compensation among the engineering class that has led to what we call compaction, or a situation where subordinate engineers may be making more than the supervisor engineer, and then there's not much incentive to want to move up in the chain in that circumstance. Fortunately, the governor's budget proposal this year provides some dollars for us to address that issue at the department in terms of how we work out those compensation matters. And so that's something we're taking up. So I would comment on that. And there are many things in Mr. Kaufman's presentation that I hear, and I think about the recommendation in the report toward improving strategic partnerships at the department. And those partnerships, to me, include our local partners, but also how we interact with industry. And so I take Mr. Kaufman at his word, and I take up his offer to work closely on addressing these issues as we go forward. So
and to that regard, I have one last question, and I know Senator Pavley has some questions and comments. So in your experience, Mr. Rogers or Eric, are there best practices in terms of establishing these partnerships, not just with the contract agencies, but with the employees as well? So we've had a lot of testimony, particularly in the last hearing, about people who have served the state well for many years, who felt like, at least on the project, specifically the Bay Bridge, they didn't feel like their comments that were meant to be constructive were listened to and actually seemed to not be very welcome. So I know Secretary Kelly believes strongly that we need to change that. Is there a template that we can use from your recommendations to do that?
I don't know if there's a template per se beyond, accept people for what they are, help them develop as they can, show some respect, but, tough love, whatever. That's not a template. But I do know that there are a number of departments that have gone through exactly the change that you're seeking here. And we have at SSTI a number of the people who led those changes, and they could tell you, it's not a science, certainly. It's an art, and like any political project, there's no substitute for judgment or leadership. But yes, you're going to recruit and enlist the support of other people in the department who want to get the change that you want. It's a management problem. In any change, the old saw that certainly in any big public bureaucracy, there's maybe 10 or 15% of the people are going to be with you on the change. There are going to be 10 or 15% who are going to be totally opposed and just try to outlast you. There are going to be 60% who are going to be willing to follow the lead or basically with you but not going to show leadership themselves. So what has to happen now is to find the 10 to 15% that are with you right now, that are in the department, and generalize, make the thing viral. Get a bug out there in Caltrans that, yeah, we're doing things differently, and this is more fun, it shows more respect for us, it's more useful, we get more respect in the state, blah, blah, blah. That's the process. It's not an event. It's block and tackle and making judgments about people's ability, who's got light behind the eyes, who's got their fire in the belly, blah, blah, blah. It's not a science.
A lot of blah, blah. One thing that Mr. Kaufman, one other thing that Mr. Kaufman said that's alarming is that contractors stopped bidding projects in California. So you would intuitively get from that, if there are less bidders, if going back to this comment about communication, specifically in this instance with the contractors, but I would say it will apply to employees as well. If people aren't bidding projects in California, I assume that affects both the quality of the bids, the quality of work, and the cost. If 20% of the contractors just don't want to do business here, that obviously isn't good for the taxpayers in California.
Could I just throw in one thing on this culture issue that, and it was, well, we didn't have administrative cost comparisons along the lines that Mr. Kaufman was rolling out. We were in complete alignment on this culture thing, I think. What we called a culture of fear, and what you were, Senator, what you were getting at a minute ago, the culture of fear maybe on people blowing the whistle or so forth. We didn't hear much about that. We really did not. There's nothing in the report about it. It could be an issue, and just out of all the people we talked to, it didn't come up. What we heard about was more along the lines of what Mr. Kaufman was talking about, sort of a fear of making a decision. We heard a lot about that. We follow the book by rote. We kick the can down the road. We don't care about outcomes. We care about process and just nobody yelling at us. Keep our heads down. And we don't deviate from the standard, and we can't even change the standard because that would be taking some risk. And the department, to its credit, last year recognized that in its program review and is working on an enterprise risk management strategy. So that we wholly think that needs support and should grow and move. But just on your question about the whistleblowers, we really didn't hear it. We really did not. So it may be an issue, but it didn't come up.
It may have been more in a couple of specific projects. Senator Pavley, sorry to take so long.